Hi everyone, we'll just wait for people to join, see the numbers coming through pretty quick. So we'll start in about 30 seconds or a minute or so. Well, kia ora and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us on today's Marsh Cyber Masterclass session. What a great turnout we have in attendance today. So really do appreciate you all tuning in. So today's session is the third of a 6-part series, which we are delving deep into some of the really important aspects of all things cyber risk. And today we will be talking about all things towards managing your very own critical supply chain risk from a cyber perspective. My name is John O'Sue and I'm the head of cyber specialty here at Marsh, New Zealand. I'm based in Auckland and I'm the local arm of the wider Marsh Pacific cyber risk and insurance broking team here in Aotearoa. Alongside me presenting today is my colleague Faisal Janif. Faisal has recently joined us at Marsh as head of cyber consulting in the advisory team in Sydney. Faisal is a senior security executive with over 20 years experience in leading cyber in business and consulting, and sits on the executive advisory board for the Australian Information Security Association and is the founder of the Cyber 12. So the game plan for today is to provide you with some key points to think about and consider when it comes to addressing both your IT supply chain and your traditional non-IT supply chain from a cyber risk perspective. We'll first provide a bit of context as to what's going on in this space and why it's an area of cyber risk that needs to be addressed properly. As we're certainly aware, supply chains in general can often be overlooked as a critical risk area for any organization. Faisal will then take the lead in the first half of the session on the IT supply chain, and I'll sub in for the second half to talk about the traditional non-IT supply chain, followed by some quick commentary around how insurance can play a part in this complex puzzle. Lastly, we'll spend some time answering your questions, so please send them through to the Q&A as the session goes in the tab in the Zoom controls below. We'll of course try to answer as many questions as possible live today at the very end. But given there are a few hundred of you dialed in, please do bear with us if we do end up missing your question live, and we'll work our hardest to get back to you offline after the session for anything unanswered. We'll aim to speak for close to an hour and leave some time at the end for questions, of course, wrapping up latest 1:30 Australian Eastern Time and latest 3:30 New Zealand time. So you might get some time back in your calendar. The recording will also be sent out for this session to all registered participants at the end of the week, along with the recording of session 4, which is about the anatomy of an insurance claim, which is on Thursday, if you have registered to that as well. So we thought we'd start today's session with a bit of an analogy to better illustrate cyber supply chains, and what better way to do this than by using a very relevant and real-life example of COVID-19. So we named the session Chains of Transmission, as it's been thrown out around in both the scientific community and sort of the public arena in general when describing how COVID-19 has been transmitting. Earlier this year in New Zealand anyway, during our first lockdown, we were encouraged to essentially stay at home to break that chain of transmission as quick as possible. So I guess from my perspective, that's kind of where the inspiration came from to name this session today. If you think about it, there are a good number of lessons that we have learnt about dealing with a biological virus that we can certainly apply to understanding how digital viruses, or cyber outbreaks, if you will, work in their own right. All it takes is for one person in the community, or in other words, one link in the supply chain to be infected for a nasty piece of malware to quickly spread throughout a network. Also, even when dealing with a potential viral outbreak or a cyber incident, in other words, enforcing a lockdown on either communities or networks, the knock-on effects can certainly have a huge impact down the line, even if you aren't directly infected yourself. So why is talking about supply chain risk from a cyber perspective important? It's surely no surprise to anyone how interdependent and interconnected our economies are now, and that certainly applies to organizations on a more micro level as well. We talk to clients all the time about their cyber risks, and most of the focus by default tends to be on their own environments and their own processes and controls that they have in place, which is of course incredibly important. But what often happens is that the supply chain and their third-party vendors often get overlooked until we steer the conversation in that direction. So no organization is an island alone, and I can't name one organization that doesn't somehow rely on a third party from an IT or digital perspective for their own operations, whether it's a managed service provider for IT, a cloud storage provider, or a software as a service firm. Additionally, the flow-on effect of the flow of more traditional goods and services can also grind to a halt if a key supplier in the ecosystem is disrupted by a cyber event. And we'll be talking about a pretty prominent example of that later in our talk. So from our point of view, organizations need to be having more frequent and transparent conversations with their own suppliers on the controls and protocols that they have in place to ensure that they're hitting the mark when it comes to cyber and data security. This will provide you with some assurance that A, incidents will be harder to transmit down the supply chain, and B, that the impact on your operations can certainly be minimized in the event of a cyber incident disrupting one of your critical suppliers. So I will now pass the torch onto Faisal, who will unpack the IT supply chain and provide some great insights onto how best manage that kind of risk.
Great. Thank you, Jono. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you all for making the time to attend. Today, I'm going to talk to you about understanding cyber in our supply chain and what you can do to minimize the impacts of a supply chain cyber breach to your organization. When we talk about cyber supply chain, we talk about threats that the vulnerabilities are likely to be exposed to and the impact to your organization. To start off with, I wanted to talk about Marsh, who was affected by the NotIT, and some of the impacts if in the current environment, this type of attack happened. What would this mean? And how would it affect the recovery process? So Marsh was, when NotPetya hit, Marsh wasn't initially impacted, right? So where it came in was an accounting software. So the finance controller had asked the IT administrator to install an accounting software, which was ME-Doc, on one single laptop. And due to the infection in ME-Doc, it spread through Marsh like wildfire. So the whole lap system was down, the containers were down globally, the ports had trucks lined up globally, not knowing what was going on, communications were halted, and Marsh had to mobilize. So they had to mobilize their IT staff, they had to use some of their vendors like Deloitte, and they all got together in the UK. Right now, the whole process was to try and bring their technology back up and restore the information. So they had roughly around 150 domain controllers scattered around globally. And due to the way that NotPetya infected the whole space, all of these domain controllers were down. They were all infected. So what that left was a significant vulnerability and IT not knowing how they were going to be able to recover. But fortunately for Maersk, what actually happened in Ghana, one of their domain controllers, there was a power outage. So while the whole infection spread through the organization, this little domain controller in Ghana was just left there without any power. So Maersk had to then get that back to their site in the UK in order for its IT staff to start rebuilding. Now that posed another couple of issues in order for people getting their visas, etc. So they had people fly out from the UK and from Ghana and meet somewhere in the middle and then physically bring the controller back. Now, if you take that into today's current environment where because of COVID, we had travel restrictions, border closures, etc. Yeah, this would have then posed some real significant impacts to how Maersk recovered. So this is just some food for thought. So moving on to the next slide. So when we talk about our vendor security, our supply chain security, a lot of organizations, what they do is they send out a security questionnaire to their suppliers. Once filled out, it comes back, the teams have a look, and okay, that's fine, right? So then they sort of move on. Right? But what is actual required is an in-depth understanding of your supply chain and the level of security that your vendor has. Right? It's always a good idea to have security built into your contracts. So if you have any regulatory requirements that need to be as a part of your service, it is always a good idea to have them built into the contract. The security self-assessments, you should always validate the answers on these documents just to make sure that what your supplier is saying is actually happening. It's good practice to perform audits, view vulnerability and penetration testing reports. This will give you an understanding of the types of vulnerabilities the organization has, the level, the consistency in performing vulnerability scans, and the patching regime, and also understanding what comes out in the penetration reports. Another good thing to understand is, do they have cyber insurance? Right. If you have a look at what's come out by the ACSC, the ongoing service and administration of equipment and services that's generally deployed in an organization, it's a significant vector for risk. As an example, if you look at organizations that have significant exposure to MSP, managed services providers, from 2016 to 2018, this was one of the most commonly observed realized risks by the ACSC. The relatively low cost of exploitation, the extensive access that it provided to various customers that the MSP provided services for, it was difficult to detect, and the complexity of actually remediating this makes it for one of the critical criminal groups to exploit multiple victims. So this allows criminals to hack into an MSP provider, and if their security isn't great, then it has access to quite a number of different customer data. So you need to always ensure that you check your vendor's security maturity. It's a critical part of it. Next slide, please. We also need to really understand the data interconnection, right? So when we work closely with vendors, we're really reliant on them on providing a service that we require. And as a part of that service, they will need to have access to certain information that we have, right? So it's quite imperative that you understand the data systems that you share. You need to understand when the data is in transit from the vendor to you, there is a risk of tampering. data extraction, which could enable immediate or future malicious operations, right? You need to also understand the data that's being used. Is there PII data, IP? What would the impact be if that data was to be exposed? Understand who has access to what data. So in your supply chain, who is actually viewing your data? What type of access do they have? Is there any level of control that's been put in place on who can view your data? Is there a PAM solution, privilege access management? Is there a DLP solution with classification, which only allows certain people to have view the data? The data is very strictly controlled as to where it can and can't be sent. Yeah, understanding admin rights, right? How many people have admin rights? Is it closely monitored, right? Data from the Ponemon Institute survey pointed out that 35% of organizations have a document approach as to which of the vendors they are sharing sensitive information with. So that leaves a significant chunk of the pie that organizations really don't understand what data is being exposed to the vendors and what level of control the vendors have internally for people that are viewing their data. Next slide, please. One of the key things of any organization is a security awareness training. People are one of the largest single points of failure. So we need to ensure that our suppliers have cyber training as a part of their induction training for all new staff. We need to ensure that they have a periodic training regime for all staff, updating them on phishing emails, talking about password security, talking about different types of social engineering attacks. Right? We need to understand, do they have a regime where they're constantly sending out phishing emails, right? To understand, how many people are actually falling for these phishing emails, right? How many people are actually clicking on the link, right? Do they run security awareness campaigns where at certain times a year they'll have certain campaigns regarding phishing or social engineering or ransomware, or just reminding people just to be quite vigilant in what's happening in today's current environment and of any security threats. Yeah. Do staff know how to report if they see a phishing email that's come through? Do they know how to report it, or do they just delete it, or what actually happens in this space? And it's quite important that you're across the security awareness and training programs, because the vendors that you're working with, they are holding some of your crown jewels, so your critical data, right? And you need to ensure that their staff are across what malware is out there, what these cyber attackers are doing in this space. Next slide, please. One of the key things to any incident is managing the incident and responding to the incident. So initially, if you go back to the first slide where I talked about, understanding the cyber posture of your suppliers, of your supply chains, your vendors, right? And I mentioned a cyber questionnaire, right? That questionnaire that people fill out, it's a lot of the answers in those questionnaires are their thoughts on where their maturity model is, right? And incident response is one of the key things, because it's one of those things where even if you have some of the best tools in your security environment and you're not able to respond to an incident in a timely and appropriate manner, that will still cause significant damage to your organization. So you need to understand with your vendors, do they have an incident response plan? And if they answered yes, then that's really, really good, right? But we need to also understand is, have they actually ran a tabletop exercise on that plan? Do people know exactly what they need to do as a part of that incident response plan? Their security operations center or the security teams, are they monitoring critical systems, right? Do they have the appropriate capability to monitor those systems, right? Because the whole side of the security operations or the security incident event management, the SIEM tool, it actually that's where the incidents are picked up, right? So you need to ensure that there's appropriately skilled people that are monitoring these tools. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of incidents that go unmanaged and that could pose significant threats. Does the organization use playbooks? So the aim of a security playbook is to ensure that all members of the crisis management team have a clear understanding of their roles and responsibilities towards cybersecurity. They understand what they need to do in this. They understand certain people will make certain decisions. Who are these decision makers? Who will make the decision on whether this incident involves reporting to the government in NDB? How often is the incident response plan being tested? Right. So these are some of the key things that you need to understand from your vendors in order to then be able to manage that risk. And this has a direct and significant impact to your organization, because if one of your vendors that houses your critical information or provides a service that's critical to the running of your organization has a cyber attack, how are they going to respond in order for you to have a minimum impact? Over to you, Jono.
Great, thanks, Faisal. So we want to spend the second half of today's session focusing on the impacts of a cyber event on the traditional non-IT supply chain, as I mentioned earlier, which again is an area that is very often overlooked, just like the IT supply chain. But it certainly shouldn't be an area that is overlooked going forward. It should be really an area of concern for every organization, regardless of the industry or sector that you're in. So we're now changing our mindset back to that old, the brick and mortar type of supply chain. Yes, I know it can be tricky to essentially make the mindset shift between the physical supply chain and how the digital world can have an impact on it. But I hope that so far you're starting to pick up on how closely these worlds are actually very much interconnected. So remember that the likelihood of one of your critical suppliers being disrupted by a cyber incident is these days just as probable as them being impacted by a flood or fire or one of those traditional perils, with those ripple effects causing essentially a much wider disruption on those that are dependent on them in the supply chain. So building on what Faisal said on Maersk earlier, I want to quickly touch on the impact of NotPetya on the non-IT side of their supply chain. So what happened with Maersk in 2017 is still one of the biggest examples of a cyber event, essentially highlighting the vulnerabilities of the global supply chain, which is why we keep referring back to it. The immediate impact on Maersk because of this devastatingly crippling piece of code meant that they had hundreds of ships around the world essentially just stranded in the ocean, and thousands of these containers essentially stuck with no really real way of tracking what inventory was on there until they could come back online. So the ripple effects down the supply chain meant that certain ports around the world, remember the Port of New York was a big example here, they were unable to essentially receive instructions on the cargo as to where everything was. So can you just imagine a giant Tetris puzzle of cargo containers and no one knew what was in them, rendering their port operations really a logistical nightmare. On land, the trucking and freight forwarding companies were left in the dark and scrambling to figure out what to do as a core distribution channel, while an unimaginable amount of stock and cargo for both commercial businesses and end consumers were backlogged for months, even after the initial incident was actually dealt with. So the main takeaway from this story is that Maersk played a vital role, it still does play a vital role in the global supply chain, and that the unintended consequences of that one attack was felt by businesses and consumers that don't even have a direct relationship with Maersk. Other examples in recent years of supply chain disruption from a cyber event include a virus shutting down a major iPhone component manufacturer in Taiwan, an Australian wool auction site being impacted by ransomware this year, causing wider disruption to farmers that couldn't sell their stock. And on a slightly lighter note that definitely made some headlines for obvious reasons earlier this year, Lion had to pre-warn of a temporary beer shortage when they were hit by a ransomware event this year, in which their brewing operations had to halt as a precaution until the incident was properly ring-fenced. So what can you do to practically address your non-IT supply chain risk from a cyber incident? We unfortunately can't offer you a silver bullet, but we can provide you with this framework that we use to address core aspects of cyber risk as a whole, and it certainly can be applied to the supply chain aspects as well. This is our Marsh cyber framework to holistically tackle complex elements of cyber risk, and it definitely is a complex beast to tackle, which can essentially be broken down into 3 parts. So that's A, understanding or identifying what the risk is, B, measuring or quantifying that risk, and C, managing the risk that you have or are working to further understand and measure. It's definitely not rocket science, but it certainly has helped a good number of our clients so far in this regard. So I'll go through each of these aspects of the framework to demo at a high level how it applies to non-IT supply chain cyber risk and how you can potentially apply this framework to your organization. So firstly, what can you do to better understand your traditional critical supply chain risk? So start working as a business to ask some questions of these, ask some key questions and work through them as a project. It's great for the 2021 strategy pipeline if you need something for any of your papers coming up. If you haven't done so already, please start identifying who your critical suppliers are and what their relationship is with your business. If you do know who your key suppliers are already, start opening up a dialogue with them, specifically asking what they're doing to work on their cyber risks and how they'll prevent and manage cyber incidents if they do happen. Additionally, consider working towards pulling together a wider supply chain map of potential players potential suppliers higher in the supply chain that you may not have a direct or contractual relationship with, and what the risk could be to you if those indirect players are actually impacted. So again, think about that Maersk example. Also start identifying or revisiting what the logistical and practical direct impacts would be on your business operations in the event of a supply chain breakdown. This would certainly help towards the risk management side once your organization better understands what the real-time and real-life consequences could be of a supply chain disruption. And thirdly, know where you sit as an organization in your client's supply chain and what the consequences could be on them if the goods and services that you provide them are disrupted. Explore the potential liability, what that could be as well, and what contracts you have in place with your customers. By having these conversations really up and down the supply chain throughout the business ecosystem, essentially these collective efforts over time will start raising awareness and really the overall standards of supply chain cyber risk management, which is definitely something we'd love to see over time. And lastly, consider setting up an internal workshop or brainstorming sessions specifically towards understanding your critical supply chain risk from a cyber perspective and start talking about these points above. So what can you do to better measure your non-IT supply chain risk? This is certainly a trickier fog of war to uncover, but there are a few methods or starting points to work from at least. So it's really about identifying what the financial implications are on your business in the event of a supply chain breakdown. You can certainly build off any of the scenarios identified above, or have the financial impacts attributed based on each key supplier, assuming that they went offline. So you can start quantifying based on what you identify in the previous section. So start also identifying what additional costs, if any, may be involved to address a supply chain breakdown. Now this could range from overtime costs to temporarily establishing alternative supply routes or providers as a contingency plan if you don't already have them on hand. Also brainstorm what these costs could be depending on the potential length of the supply chain disruption. So it can definitely vary depending on if someone is down for 1 day versus six weeks to 2 months. Again, we acknowledge that measuring the financial impact of a supply chain disruption is incredibly complicated, and it often involves working, pretty closely and over some time with, your analytics teams, financial accountants, or external consultants to do so, and the results of which are generally probabilistic only. So if you have the means or the resources to do so, we certainly do encourage you to explore carrying out some business interruption loss modeling or brainstorming to better measure what the impacts could actually be on your organization from a balance sheet standpoint, specifically to a supply chain breakdown. On a simpler scale, perhaps work with your finance and procurement teams to workshop that internally. If you don't have, analytics teams on hand or analytics people in your organization, and what that rough ballpark figure could be from a loss perspective to give you a better idea. So once again, this is a key concept that you can take away after today's session and apply it to your organization as it suits you. There's definitely no one way of doing this. So onto our final pillar of the framework, managing your non-IT supply chain risk. What can you do to practically manage this to either reduce the chances of a supply chain breakdown from a cyber event, or to mitigate the impacts of one if it does happen? So start by exploring what your contingencies and business continuity planning is around supply chain risk. Ask yourself, do you have tested business continuity plans in place specifically to a key supplier going offline? Has this been thought out or discussed at all? Start by asking these questions and putting some good contingencies in place. Secondly, have you carried out audits and contract reviews of key suppliers of goods and services to you? Do you know what they are doing to manage their own internal cyber risks? Again, echoing what Faisal said before, and what continuity plans or contingencies do they themselves have in place? So it's really important to start having these conversations once again. It's really easy to overlook these areas when it comes to deciding or speaking with suppliers, and questions that may never really have been raised before, even with suppliers that you might have had a relationship with for decades. So asking these questions can certainly assist in preventing an event, a cyber incident from happening altogether up in the supply chain, if you as a client are expecting your suppliers to be meeting certain standards on a day-to-day basis. So thirdly, do you have forward-thinking strategies around managing key supply chain risk and governance buy-in overall? Getting support from the exec and board level is critical towards getting any real progress, as we all know. So again, start getting these issues on the board paper and on the agendas, really, especially if you start identifying and measuring supply chain cyber risk as a significant exposure to your organization. So lastly, if your organization hasn't done so already, do consider exploring an insurance response to critical supply chain disruption as a result of a cyber incident in conjunction with the risk management and risk mitigation controls that you already have in place. So nice little segue into this. How can insurance help when it comes to covering losses as a result of supply chain exposure? So first up, many modern cyber insurance policies do factor in disruption to an organization if caused by an IT service provider outage, which in turn causes contingent business interruption loss to the policyholder. This is generally part and parcel of most modern cyber wordings now. It wasn't really the case, 3 to 5 years ago, but it is now. But like any insurance, we do, of course, encourage you to please check the definitions in these wordings or ensure that you speak to your broker about this. Coverage can also be looked at for contingent BI and disruption for the traditional brick and mortar non-IT suppliers. But this is generally covered only by endorsement as a special extension to the policy coverage and not built in as a default like it is for the IT service providers. And of course, this can take a bit of extra underwriting as well due to the risk. On a final note, just remember that contingent business interruption coverage from a cyber event bringing down an IT provider or a traditional supplier is only one aspect of what cyber insurance policies can now look to cover you for. Clients that do have cyber insurance policies in place are seeing huge value at claim time in regards to simply dealing with a cyber incident in terms of the immediate response and really the wealth of insurer-backed resources now made available to simply just investigate, ring fence, and eliminate an intrusion if it were to happen, and really to just assist with the recovery efforts overall. There's also the liability coverage elements specifically for privacy or security incidents down the line. If you're, liable for anyone who's relying on you in the supply chain for any residual claims that may arise from that. So to wrap up, I know we've still got a little bit of time in, so we can give you back some time in your diaries today. Please ensure that you do carry out due diligence when dealing with your supply chains. That's really the overarching message today, is to do your due diligence, continue to do it if you already are. And if this is the first time you're addressing it, I hope you've got some good takeaway points from this today. Look for continued improvements from your supply chain on an annual basis. So this is never just a one-stop or one-off project. It should be something that you continue to have on your agendas with your suppliers. And thirdly, ensure redundancies and contingencies are definitely built into contracts with your suppliers. So there's definitely some extra bandwidth there, especially from a response end if the worst does happen. And of course, a recording will be made available of this session, as mentioned earlier, and sent out to all registered attendees at the end of the week after the session on Thursday. So I will now move on to the Q&A section. Please do feel free to type in the Q&A box in the controls below, and we'll answer them as soon as we can. Faisal, just got a quick question just to start off. Just bring that up here. Is there anywhere we can go for further resources and information specifically for supply chain risk?
Yeah, definitely. The Australian government has been doing a lot of work around supply chain risk, managing supply chain risk, and helping organisations really understand what to do in this space. So the ACSC, which is the Australian Cyber Security Centre, if you visit their website, they have a number of links in there which will provide you with a lot of information, and also there's templates there which you can use to send to your vendors. in order for and that template is based on the ASD Essential 8, and that will help you understand their security posture. And the ASD also, which is the Australian Signals Directorate, on their website, they also have information on there on how to manage supply chain risk.
Excellent. Thanks, Faisal. I haven't got too many extra coming at the moment, but I guess just to open the conversation, if we want to, get any sort of creative juices flowing. Faisal, from your experience before you joined Marsh, was there any sort of big issues that you saw or that you dealt with personally from a supply chain, or even from a traditional sort of brick and mortar supply chain in regards to cyber?
Yeah, look, Jono, the key issues that we face as an organization when we do question our supply chain, our vendors in their security posture is that there's a sense of hesitation, reluctance to share all information, right? And that could pose, a risk, raise alarm bells in terms of, why are you not sharing certain information that we need in order to be able to understand. The other part of it is we don't really understand what we're getting and what's on offer. So as an example, if you use, Microsoft, right, as a vendor that provides some critical services, your emails, your OneDrive, your Teams, we're not sure what level of security we're getting in these applications from Microsoft, right? And very rarely people check. They just, assume that it's secured. If you have vendors which have critical infrastructure, right, to get an understanding of their security around critical infrastructure, that's quite difficult at times, right? So therefore, it's quite imperative that from the word go, when we start these initial conversations, that we want to have a good understanding of the supply chain, the vendors' security. What are the exposures and what the impacts these exposures have on your business, and to take it one step further, what that means to your customers. Right, so it's a knock-on effect, and it's something that, as we go by, gains more and more momentum, right? Because we're now, quite heavily outsourced in a lot of things, right? So it really pays dividends to be able to do your due diligence in this space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Faisal. I've got a question here. I think it's probably more for me from an insurance side. In the event of an incident, should an insured simply just go with the underwriter suppliers in assisting with the recovery, or should the insured look at leveraging off its own existing service providers to manage the recovery? So it's actually, it's quite a common question we do get asked. A lot of the insurers, of course, they do have their default panel, but they are very open to working with any existing service providers that you may have. And we do encourage you, especially if you do have existing relationships with them, if they understand your businesses and understand your networks and how you operate. It's definitely a win-win situation for all involved, rather than someone external coming in during crisis time to figure out really how you work as an organization. So we do encourage you, if you do have preferred suppliers that you already work with, definitely get this signed off by the insurance if you have a policy already, so that everyone's on the same page, and do that before an incident does happen. Faisal, I've got probably one for you if you can come back online. What if there is resistance from your suppliers to be open and to share their IT security protocols when you come to ask for it? Sort of how do you tackle these confidentiality issues if they do arise? Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah, so you really don't want to. You can go back and say, look, we really don't want to see your customer data or your customer details, right? We want to understand what your capability is, right? So going back, and the easiest way to do it is the ASD Essential 8, which is the Australian Signals Directorate. They got what they call the Essential 8. So 8 key things which an organization needs to do in order to have the bare minimum security capability, right? And you can request how they where do they stack up. You can understand what their vulnerability scanning regime is, right, without having to view what all their vulnerabilities are, right? You can understand, have a look and see if they have a patching regime, right? How often do they do penetration testing? Do they have a security operations center, right? Do you have an incident response plan, right? you know Firewalls, right? What type of firewalls are you using? It gives you an understanding of this client security maturity, right? Are your endpoints secure? Are you using, a SIEM tool, right? Do you have EDR in your endpoints, right? So there's a whole bunch of questions that you can ask in terms of really understanding the maturity level without getting any PII data from your customer, right? So if they're pushing back and saying, no, it's confidential information, then there's a couple of things. Either one, you're asking the wrong questions, or two, they're trying to hide something and not be fully disclosed, right? So a good example is if you ask a client on their security policy, and they turn around and say, our security policy is based on the ISO 27001, right? Which is really great, right? But so the ISO 27001 security policy, it's quite a broad policy. It's quite generic and it's adaptable to any given industry, right? But what makes it different and customizable to you is the underlying standards and guidelines that you build, right? That's where you can have a look and really understand the level of maturity that the organization is bringing, right? So, and that's what I mean when I say, make sure you do your due diligence and check the documentation, right? Because that it's not giving away any PII data or highly sensitive data. What you're having a look at is what they're doing in terms of building up their security standards and guidelines and their maturity level, how they're governing it, right? And that's the key thing.
Excellent. Thank you, Faisal. I think it's a very well balanced answer there. Got one here. I think another one for you. Given how reliant organizations have become on the cloud, what is the current thinking from an industry perspective and the IT and cyberspace on the large-scale accumulation loss resulting from a major failure of a cloud provider or critical network infrastructure? In your opinion, is there enough resilience to prevent really what probably would be a societal disaster?
Yeah, look, I don't, in my opinion, there isn't at the moment. I think what's happening is, as we're moving more and more into this space, there's more and more security coming out of there. There's more and more clarity and understanding coming out of there. But one of the key things is, you have to still, while you're working, whether you're with, AWS or you're using Azure, you have to look at what security tools are available in this space, the type of data that you have in the cloud. And a good starting point is having a CASB tool, which is a cloud access security broker. Right, so that is a good starting point if you've got data in the cloud.
Excellent. Thank you, Faisal. Just got one more question here. I'll take this one. Are insurance underwriters open to exploring premium discounts based on cybersecurity investments? So this is definitely a bit of a balancing act. I know it'll always be great to see, if you invest in, really good sort of threat detection software, you're going to get 5% off the premium. Unfortunately, it will never be that transparent. The underwriters do obviously factor these things in when it comes to pricing from a holistic perspective. When it comes to implementing certain aspects of cybersecurity or technology, and if it's especially really strong controls, the insurers tend to be preferable when it comes to coverage. So not necessarily on the premium discounts, but they'd be more favorable to providing you, sort of areas which may by default be sublimited. They might be more open to giving you some larger coverage there, or let's say if you want to take a lower excess, they'd possibly be open to sort of, I guess, wearing a bit more risk themselves. So it's more from a coverage standpoint as opposed to direct premium discounts. So unless there's any other questions, I think we'll definitely put some time back in the calendars for on today. I know end of month is always an exciting time for all. So look, hey, it's certainly been great to share some of our insights with you all today. And thank you very much once again for joining. The supply chain and cyber risk is no doubt a complicated beast to tame. So we really hope our discussions today have at least helped you along the journey, or at least give you a bit of some starting points to carry on with this. The attendance on our Cyber Masterclass series has so far been hitting what we're seeing are some record highs for us internally, and today's session looks to be no different. So once again, we do really appreciate your time this afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the Cyber Masterclass sessions if you've registered for more. Again, the next one is on Thursday on the anatomy of a claim. And please, of course, do stay safe for the rest of 2020, no matter where you are. So thank you very much. Thank you, Faisal.
Thank you, everyone.